Okay, good morning. This morning we're going to tackle GDP training, which stands for Good Documentation Practices. You're very close. Good documentation practice. As we talked about yesterday, GDP starts at the very beginning and needs to be carried through all of our documents as we go all the way through TOPs. So every single person in this room at their piece of the pie is going to need to practice GDP in the documentation that you're doing for your stage of practice. So we're going to talk about what GDP is and why it's important, who needs to use it and when. We're going to give you some do's and don'ts and the implications of not using it properly. So it's actually regulated by the FDA, believe it or not. The FDA is the one that came up with this. Good documentation practices. And it's CFR, which you'll hear about. There's different CFR part this, CFR part that regulates all these different pieces in a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. Part 210, 211, and 212 is what regulates GDP specifically. So there's a little acronym called ALCOA, and then they added the plus onto it a number of years ago. So you'll hear, every once in a while, you might hear ALCOA Plus. And we'll talk about what that means specifically. But it's to help us remember the different aspects of GDP and how we need, all the different things that we need to do for it. So it's data integrity is what it boils down to. A lot of the GDP stuff I've cut out of this lesson because it doesn't apply to you. There's all kinds of things that have to happen in the laboratory and in manufacturing and all that stuff that does not apply to you guys. I'm only talking about the things that are going to specifically apply to you and your work. ALCOA stands for attributable, legible, contemporaneous, which is a fancy word for time. It needs to be in the right time, at the time that it happens. It needs to be original, it needs to be accurate, and then when they added the plus, complete, traceable, permanent, enduring, available, and consistent. How's that for a mouthful? So we say ALCOA Plus for short. So it needs to be traceable. So traceability kind of goes back to, for us, more like an MTR. What does an MTR actually do? What's the reason that we have MTRs? It's material traceability. You can trace with an MTR if you had to. You could trace it all the way back to the mine that the ore came from. All the way back to the very beginning. So the whole idea of MTRs and traceability is if we have a problem, if we have contamination in a line, we need to be able to figure out why. What is the source of the contamination? And it could be the metallics. It could be the ore that was used to produce the material. So it's the same thing. We're tracing the whole life of everything we're doing in documents. So material, workmanship, where and how things were built. And remember, the people that we're trying to communicate this to are people that never had anything to do with the construction of the building. They know nothing about it. They don't do what you do. They're just people that are on the receiving end translating documents. So FDA, owner, CQB, future people, they might come back to a document 10 years later. Maybe they didn't even work there then. Maybe they had nothing to do with the project and have no idea what the scope of it even was. So Mr. Chow, again, is reminding us that we have to document it. When do we do it? Our ISOs are probably the most important piece of GDP for us in this market sector. Even if you can get somebody to forgive some of our issues on a startup report or a commissioning report or any other kind of report like that, they're not going to forgive GDP errors on an ISO, ever. I've never seen it happen. So ISOs, pressure tests, flush reports, those are the number one things that they're going to be picking at you about GDP. Startup and testing reports, it's really very helpful if we follow GDP for those because they're complete. The biggest problem I see with startup and testing reports is that there's blanks or missing information. I don't know what that means when I'm reading it. You know, if you leave a whole section blank, what does that mean? Does that mean you just didn't do it? Does that mean it's not applicable? I don't know. And we're left to guess, and we have to eliminate that guessing. Passivation, walkdowns, receiving reports, inspections, permits to work even, especially in a shutdown. If you're getting permits to work, they might be asking you to throw that stuff in a TOP to prove that it had been reviewed and approved by the right people.